Everything is of the circle. I think about how the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of a plant in life. I think of the cycles of a human life. And I think of how the more we understand the cycles of life, the more we understand the cycles of peacemaking and the importance of that. And I think about how there are so many circles in nature that teach us. And I think of the children and how we need to teach our children about the cycles of life, because that's where the peacemaking starts. It starts from them having experiences where they know that things are connected. And I love the story of the Asani Circle game, where the FA children of the Ituri forest of the Congo, they get together, they put their feet touching one to the another all the way around, and they create a circle together with their feet. And they start to go around the circle with sharing. One child will say, something circular is the moon. Another circle is our eyeball. Another circle is the sun. And on they go until they go to another layer, and they say the circle of family. They talk about the circle of regeneration, like we heard earlier today. They talk about the cycles that exist in the seasons, the cycle that exists in the womb of my mother. The cycles and cycles until you can't think of anything else, and then you back out of the circle until there's one child left who knew more of the cycles of life and the connections of life than any other child. And I really believe that it's important that we look to the indigenous cultures of this land and all of the lands to learn how to be peacemakers. And I thank Bill Mollison for this, because he, right from the start, said we have to honor not just the natural cycles, but we have to honor where it existed in the people, in indigenous and intact peoples through time. And I want to share a story of one of the elders in my life who I learned a lot about peacemaking. A beautiful man who just passed just recently, Jake Swamp. And he was sharing a story of a time when his people in upstate New York were starting to get sick. They were starting to have deformities in the children that were being born. They were starting to have premature deaths in the elders. There was a lot of illness happening on their reservation. So they called in the New York State Health Department, and they started testing different aspects of the reservation. And of course, they went right to the water. And they found that there were several toxins that were in the water that were industrial toxins that had been released upstream that were likely the cause of all the illness that they were experiencing. So they went upriver, and they started to look for where that toxins were entering, and they came across a factory that had been fairly recently put in, about 4 or 5 years before. And they tested the water just below the factory, and they found that there was a high toxin level, and then right above the factory, they couldn't find any sign of it. So they went and basically knocked on the door of this multinational corporation, and they talked to the administrator at that factory, and they told him what was happening. They showed him the data, but sure enough, they said, the law says we can do it. And they said, well, what about the ethics of it? You know, we have children that are being born sick. We have miscarriages. We have all these things. But, you know, is there no ethic? And just because the law says that you can do something doesn't mean you should. And so they had to go a different route, because they weren't going to change a thing, because it was still legal to put those particular toxins in the river. And they started a public campaign around the whole Northeast, and finally, after over a year and continuing illness on their land from their polluted water, they got enough attention that the multinational corporation that owned that particular factory agreed to give them 45 minutes to make a presentation at a board of directors meeting in New York City. So all of the people, the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois people, they voted that Jake should be the one, because he is a person who has devoted his life to peace. Those of you who have children, there's a wonderful book that he wrote called Giving Thanks. And he's gone around the world planting trees of peace in a tradition that is over 1,000 years old, the White Pines of Peace. And they thought Jake should be the one. So they worked on a presentation that was just 45 minutes, kind of like mine is right now. And they put together all the charts that they would need to show all the different connections and all the legalities, and off he went to New York City. So we got to the high-rise building, and he said he went into the elevator, and he said the elevator alone probably cost more than all of their houses on the reservation. And he gets to the top floor where this opulent room was staged for their board of directors meeting. Cherrywood tables, people in $4,000 suits, and he said, when he was telling me the story, he said, you know, it felt like all of that opulence was built on the backs of our sick and dying children, that they literally are stealing from their grandchildren to feed themselves these things. So he started to set up, and he got all his charts ready, and the board president said, Mr. Swamp, I would like, your 45 minutes is starting now. And so he stepped up, and he looked around, and something had come over his heart. And what had happened was his intuition kicked in, and his heart kicked in, and he knew he wasn't supposed to share the presentation that he had prepared and that all the people had helped him prepare. He realized he was to draw from an ancient tradition that was given by a peacemaker, which I'm not even allowed to say his name out of respect, from over 1,000 years previous. And it was a tradition of what they call the Thanksgiving address. And what he started to do is he started to speak in gratitude with his finest, most beautiful, life-giving words he could find about every aspect of creation or nature, whatever the word you use, this beautiful world we live in. And he started with the soils and looking at the soils and their connection to the roots of the plants, and then he worked his way up a little bit more. And he looked at all the different plants, and he gave his gratitude, and then he gave all the gratitude for all the waters of the world and the best words that he had from his life experience. Then through all of the different animals that came, that survive off all of that. And then looking even further up still, he went to the bushes and then to the trees, giving as much gratitude as he could in the most beautiful way that he could, till he got to the birds, and then further up to the waters of the atmosphere and the clouds, and then finally to the stars. And then he looked back behind him and he said, I want to honor all my ancestors. I want to honor all your ancestors. And I want to do that now too. And he looked forward and he said, and then thinking of the future generations, I want to give gratitude to the future generations, to those faces that are not yet here on the earth, that every decision, every action we make affects them. Everything we're doing is going to be accountable in the future by these children. So what is the concentric ring you're sending forward? And he gives that gratitude. And at the very end of that, how long do you think it took? 45 minutes, exactly. And he said he remembers a few people shaking their head going, stupid Indian, wasting our time. But he kept talking. He kept following his heart. So then they said, Mr. Swamp, you've used your time in that way. That's all you get. And they asked him to leave. And he walked out, and he said when he left the room, tears welled up in his eyes because he said, I think I have let my people down. And he went back to the reservation and he told them the story of how he had to follow his heart. And sure enough, they said, Uncle Jake, no, you did the right thing. You followed your heart. You followed your intuition. You drew from the ancient understandings of gratitude and connection, of knowing the cycles of life, the circles of life, and you shared it through your most beautiful words. Well, the next morning, he gets a phone call. And the phone call was one of the board of directors who said, Mr. Swamp, I have never heard such things. I have been looking at all those things that you said as a resource to be exploited and profited from. I have never heard the beauty. I've never heard the connection. I've never seen how they are connected to one another and how they're dependent on each other, how they're mutually interdependent. Mr. Swamp, from the inside of this company, I'm going to work with you to change the policies of this company. And within a year, not only did they change the policies of how that one factory was dumping its toxins into the river, but they literally changed all of the factories all over the world that company was doing because one man followed his heart. So I start this presentation today for us to remember that there are so many ways to affect positive change in the world around us. There's so many ways to be the peacemaker. And that for us to say, yeah, that multinational corporation can't be changed by me following my heart is bullshit. We have to be able to do that. We have to know that we have that power. And each of us has that power if we follow our hearts. And we do it wisely, and we do it with our strong intellect. So not only in permaculture do we draw from indigenous understandings, we also draw from nature. And I think of the fire ant from Brazil, and this is a wonderful teaching that I've recently learned. The fire ants from Brazil are literally, they have developed a response to floods. They've developed a response to catastrophe, where within 100 seconds, they can assemble over 1 million ants, and each of them excreting a tiny little bubble of oxygen that gives them their little bit of flotation. And they lock together as a group of ants to be able to outride a storm and to ride out a flood, to be able to survive as a species, as a community within a species. And they can ride out these floods for up to 2-3 weeks, according to some research that's out there. And so I share that because we can learn from our indigenous ancestors, but we can also learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters of all the plants and animals that are on this earth. Because what we're about to experience, and what we already are experiencing, is a world in crisis, where floods, like this is just from this month, some of these things that are happening, the floods that are in Pakistan. There's a huge drought affecting 35 million people in China right now. There's drought and flood all over the United States. Just a week ago, there were 5 million people who were without electricity in Southern California, and Southern California just stopped. Literally, there was no water delivery because everything relied on electric pumps. And there was no filtration, so they were asking people to boil water, but most people have stoves that are electric, so nobody could even boil their water. This was in a second in Southern California. My thought is that we need to shut off the power for a week around the world and see how people respond and shake people up to say, okay, now let's use this fossilized energy to shift what's happening in the world. Also, some of my brothers and sisters in Kenya, oops, didn't switch. My slide stopped. There we go. But all of that ends up, we have to start looking at how do we actually change some of these things they're doing? How do those fire ants, how did they come together? Why did they come together? And for humans, I think it has to do with the ethics of permaculture, the ethics that we carry, and also our worldviews that translate those ethics into our actions. Thankfully, the people who founded permaculture had the foresight to see that we needed to have ethics to guide this movement. So it, in essence, made this movement unstoppable. This movement is unstoppable because it's designed around ethics, principles, and actually principles converted to directives. And over the course of these 30 years that the movement has been growing around the world, or over 30 years, a lot of attention has been put into the care of the earth and the fair share ethics. We have gotten really good at designing on the landscapes. There are a lot of landscapes around the world that are growing and are regenerative. And even if you walk away from them, they continue to provide food. They continue to grow like a natural ecology, yet they're feeding and housing and creating medicines for people around the world. But I feel that there's still need to be done for care of the people ethic. It was actually easier with the lights off because I could picture you all naked and I wouldn't be so nervous. It was either picturing you all naked or I was going to wear a diaper. So that was it. But so I feel like the care of the earth, the care of the people ethic is something that we have to really look at in depth in this next 30 years of the permaculture movement. And it's at the root of peacemaking. I've seen a lot of really good designs on the ground around the world who have been abandoned because the people could not work it out any longer. They couldn't figure out how to work within the diversities that existed in their groups. And a lot of, 90% of intentional communities fail around the world. Well, let's not design intentional communities. Let's design communities that are based on true need. So the care of the people ethic is a really important aspect of how we're going to move forward as a group. And I feel that there's some things that we can learn about on how to translate that ethic into positive peacemaking on the ground, where our care of the earth and our fair share ethics marry beautifully with good design on the ground. So what I want to do, because I'm a tracker, I've been trained in tracking, I work with children, I teach children tracking, and I want to start to peel off some of the layers of how we can learn and how we can learn how to translate the care of the earth ethic or care of the people ethic in the most beautiful way that we can to be the most effective. And I want to draw from the directive in permaculture of working from patterns to details. And when I look at this, I start to look and say, what is it? Where is the core of peace in the care of the people ethic? And how is it, where in the world does peace actually turn into conflict? And how does that look on the landscape? How does conflict in the human heart look on the landscape? Well, let me take you to my valley. This is Cuyama Valley, and people drive by this 240-acre carrot farm where they produce over 40 tons of organic carrots for a big grocery chain called Whole Foods in America. And it is something that, to me, this is at the epitome, the track of conflict in the human heart. When you can look at this in the landscape and actually accept it as something that is normal. I don't know how we've got to this. And I mean, I look at the carrots, and it's one of those things where it's overdrafting the aquifer. They're pumping 1,200 gallons a minute, and this water we had tested by a hydrologist. The youngest water, because you can look at there's an isotope that you can date it. The youngest water that they're doing there is 16,000 years old. The oldest water is 30,000 years old. This is just not a sustainable thing, and yet we call it organic and good. And I look at the track of that and say, what is it that the human mind has allowed this to happen? And I think it's actually a form of reductionist thinking. And I think that reductionist thinking is at the root of what I see as the breakdown of peace. So many of the things that you see that are associated with reductionist thinking is stuff like the monocropping, but it's also, you see peace breaking down because of monotheistic thinking. You see all these monoisms and linearisms that come from from the mind of the modern human being. And I think that's at the very root of the breakdown of peace. And so I ask myself as a tracker, how do I change that in the kids that I'm working with and the people that I'm working with as a teacher? And I had to look one layer further into the formation of what our worldviews are. I had to peel back the layer of it. And what I found was an interesting set of studies that said there were two things that actually inform our worldviews. And that is sensory input and mind focus. Now imagine this, you have sensory input. Many of us who aren't raised in a village setting are in rooms like this that have flat walls, flat floors. All the doors here are set to a height by code that allows us to walk through without even sensing anything. We have no variegation in the environment around us. We're actually reducing our worldviews by the very environment that we spend so much time in. And so what we're finding is that with children especially, if we can get them out into the diversity of nature in healthy scenarios, that we can actually expand their worldviews just by the very nature of their sensory input being fed by the diversity of the world around them, in it more than the inside of a building, in a classroom, or in your homes. I mean, what is it? 90 kids in America spend 90% of the time indoor right now. That's the latest statistic. The other thing is mind focus. Mind focus is something of what do we give our attention to? And when we start to look at what we give our attention to now in the world, it's pretty scary. And we have whole media outlets that are saying we should be fearful. Well, as a tracker, I think of how the cougar actually hunts the coyote and how fear is the demise of the coyote. And I don't know if any of you know this, but a coyote, sometimes cougars will single out a coyote and in a pack and will go only to the scent post of that isolated, the one coyote that they picked, and they will scent mark only that coyote's scent post. So as that coyote comes back around in the circle that it makes in its territory, it realizes a cougar is on its tail. Now, some of the trackers that have been looking at this, they've actually found that the coyotes will sometimes just die of a heart attack just from fear from that. They've actually found that to be the case. But let me tell you what happens is that it puts the coyote out of its baseline gait to where it no longer can accept the input of the world around it. It can no longer see the feedback of the world around it, and it becomes prime prey to the cougar. Now let's translate that story into what we're being fed right now. We're being fed fear, 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 no solutions, that we're being put into an anxiety gate that actually limits our ability to see the feedback of all the stuff we're actually doing in the world. And it actually puts us in a place of lessened awareness. So it's something that we can shift very easily, and permaculture does it. Permaculture actually is a wonderful teacher of shifting our mind focus to positive things. Not just nature immersion, but systems designed for human settlement that are diverse as nature, or nearly as diverse as nature. We teach about pattern tracking. We teach about observation and listening, hopeful conscious design. I mean, I think of Tony's talk, and I just sat there going, oh my God, this is like, I'm so inspired. It's so possible. It's so possible. We don't have to just think about little tiny plots. We can look at, satellite imagery of changing landscapes because of conscious design. I'm so hopeful for that. And then, of course, developing life-giving pursuits that make sense, like gardening is one of those. Absolutely one of those. I'm running a little behind here, so I'm going to have to jump forward. So really what I want to, one of the things I want to share is that there is peace in permaculture. We just have to draw it out. It actually exists in the Word right now. And I want to illustrate that with a story of one of my first journeys internationally, working in Liberia, post-war, Civil War Liberia. And I was fortunate to be one of the first permaculturists in after the war. I know there's a few people that were there during the war, but it was really hard to put together trainings and demonstration sites when things were getting wiped out. But those of you who don't know the story of Liberia, there is a lot of brutality that had happened over those 15 years. And it was a beautiful country with many, many, many natural resources, and yet still peace didn't exist there. And there's a lot about that story I'm not going to tell right now. But it doesn't always mean if you have food and water that peace will prevail. There's other aspects of it. So there was not a town or village within Liberia that saw peace. There wasn't a town or village that didn't have some of its children kidnapped and brought into to be child soldiers. A lot of my work actually has been with child soldiers. That was why I was brought there, one of the reasons. And I asked some of the generals that took my permaculture course there, I asked them, former generals, I asked them, how did you get the bullets? How did you get the guns? And they said, oh, well, we worked with certain Western interests who said, if you get us these natural materials out of the forest, basically you cut your forest down because there's no government now, and you get us that materials, we'll trade it for guns and weapons. So, I mean, it was insidious what happened, and there was no family that didn't have, some aspect of their life destroyed. But the story of them coming back from that war is the one that I want to share. It came through the woman's wisdom. And I've often heard Bill and other people talk about how women have so often stood up in a way that's different than the men in changing their landscapes. And what the women did, and I had the fortune of having one of the organizers of the peace work that the women were doing. One of the organizers was in my permaculture course, and she shared that they all gathered they all gathered from all the different tribes that were fighting each other, from the different factions that were fighting each other, and the woman said, we're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to have our children killed, kidnapped. I'm not going to have my sisters raped, myself raped. I'm not going to have my husbands die, my parents, all this death. There's no reason for it. We're going to stop it. And so they gathered in the center squares of every village and city in Liberia. And they did 3 things, she said. They did 3 things. They said, 1, we're going to stop sleeping and having sex with the men of this country until the war's done. Probably the most powerful part of that. The second thing they said, which actually is way more powerful, they said, we're going to stop eating, and the women of Liberia are going to die unless this war ends. The third thing they said was that they were calling back the elephants. And I said, well, why is that? Why the elephants? They said, well, they're the harbingers of peace. They're the harbingers of peace, the harbingers of peace, pardon me. And I also happen to have the defense minister of the Lourdes Army, which was the largest army opposing the national forces, was also in my permaculture course right after the war. And I asked him, I said, how did it end for you? And he said, we had 40,000 people, we had just resupplied, we had all the weapons we needed, we were going to take Monrovia. So we stayed off the roads, we went through the jungles to remain undetected. And as we were going through the jungles, we came across a pod of elephants. Now, elephants left the country, they say, when the war started. No one, not a single person had seen an elephant, a jungle elephant, in Liberia once the war started. And he, being raised a traditionalist, said, that's it, the war's over. I know the war's over. The elephants have returned. So he ordered all 40,000 of his men to lay down their weapons with the UN, and he said, if you don't, I'll shoot you. And they did, and they did. And the United Nations says it was one of the largest armistices they had ever seen in their history. And they surrendered, it was an incredible surrender of weapons that they had never seen on this scale. And then they, shortly after that, voted the first African woman president in the history of Africa, not just Liberia, but Africa. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, by the way, is one of my heroes, because she tells every Liberian to grow a garden. She gets on the national radio and says, if you do one thing for Liberia, grow a garden. And I said, wow, I should get her a date with Bill Mollison. So as that started to happen, there was an elder who had a dream in the village in northern Liberia, which was one of the hardest hit areas of Liberia. And he said that the dream told him that the healing of the human heart must accompany the healing of the land. Absolutely had to. And he had a dream of a man that would come and he would know a certain symbol, and he would bring a teaching that his ancestors would accept. And somehow that got to me. And they thought it was me, through a series of people that met and heard that story, and they came to me and said, yep, you're the one that they dreamed about. And so I get there to Liberia, and I have a dream that night, my first night in Liberia, in northern Liberia, a man standing there with a tunic on. And on the tunic is a symbol, and it's one of their sacred symbols, and it's actually their ancestor tree. If you cut the nut open and you open it up, there's a symbol in the nut, and that's their most sacred symbol is the seed of their ancestor tree. And he said, yep, they told me that in the dream that you would know that symbol. And so when I just shared the dream, I didn't know anything. I just said, that's the dream. And they said, well, you're the one that's supposed to come. So I went up to northern Liberia and went up roads like this for days to try to get up to this area that was very remote. There was hardly any sun because the burning of the forest that was there, to this place called Voinjima, where hardly anybody was doing. This was of 20,000 people. This is the only rainwater harvesting I could find. And there were wells dug during the wet season that always dried up in the dry season by some good, Samaritan folks that were trying to dig wells for them, but they didn't think it through. So some of the things we did is we took former child soldiers who who had never been trained in anything other than taking what they want with force. We trained them to build ferrocement rainwater harvest tanks as a vocation. And it was hugely successful because all of the 20 students that took that now have that skill to take around, and the materials are available throughout Liberia to start to harvest rainwater. We also worked with, we did a design and we did our work there at a center or a house where there were 6 boys who were all former child soldiers. And we did permaculture training for them as a vocational training. The elders then wanted us to butcher a sheep, or pardon me, a goat. They wanted me to butcher a goat as a sacrifice so that the ancestors would actually come and join the course. And they said, yep, they did after we did the sacrifice. It was amazing. All the Christian organizations actually banned us after that. They said, oh, if they're making sacrifices, we can't have them there. And I said, you know, too bad. We need to bring the ancestors here. Let's do it. And a lot of the people came to the course regardless of their ministers saying that we were heathens. So one of the things we did is we looked at forest soil and we said, let's make it ourselves. And so we did a lot of work on, real hands-on work on how to create fertility rather than constantly digging into the forest. And being able to create fertility next to their houses, because it was something that some people were having to walk 3 hours one direction just to get to a place where they could find fertility, and then walk 3 hours back to their house, and yet they were pooping outside. There were animal manures everywhere, and it was all washing into their water, and they were getting cholera. So we shifted that. We shifted that. And one of the ways we shifted that is even simple gray water systems. Super simple. I think all of you have probably made some form of a gray water, like a banana circle. So we took this place that was formerly there, you know, mosquitoes were living in it and it stunk, and we created a simple gray water system that could grow 26 species of food because of the intensive nutrient that was being poured into it. So just 3 months after that, that same spot that was a stinky area giving malaria to people, you know, with the malaria coming out of it, was all of a sudden starting to become a food system. And this is it a year later. This one system, it was so simple. I mean, the solutions are so embarrassingly simple. This one system now is spread over northern Liberia because it worked, it was simple, it didn't cost a thing, and they could do it within the pattern of what they were, where they already were. And one of the elders came up to me and said, you know what, we've already been doing this. And I love that, because they had, and yet a lot of people had forgotten. This is one of their ancestral grounds that they abandoned during the war, and there it was, the banana circles were already there. I wasn't teaching them anything new. All I was doing is going in and dispelling the myth that everything Western ends in a glorious future. And I was also acknowledging the wisdom that they already carried. Absolutely. And then taking back the wisdoms that they have to even a more desperate place called America. And I constantly, the last time I was in Africa, I had a bunch of my colleagues sat together and we designed an aid course for America. And I am so excited because we're going to do it. We're going to bring some of my African colleagues over to actually reteach a lot of things that we need to learn. Isn't that cool? I got to get through. I'm just about done here, so not quite, not quite. I'm gonna skip ahead a couple slides. All right, so I'm just going to end here. There's a lot more that I have, but it never works out because I just talk and talk and talk and tell stories. So all the problems of the world can be solved in a garden, and especially if we design the garden in a way that brings healing to every individual, every family, every community, every tribe, every nation, and in every single landscape. This is where peace begins. And I ask that you follow your heart in your journey as a permaculturist, because that's where peace comes from, is in the synchronicity that comes from you following your heart, not just your brain. Use your brain as a tool, but don't let it be your guide. You know when you're working with your heart, and you know what happens when you work with your heart. You can change an entire corporation and from dumping toxins. You can change entire areas of landscapes in Niger because he followed his heart and he made the prayer, so to speak. So it's attainable. We can do this. And I want to thank you for co-creating this with me. And now our circle's complete. Thank you. Thank you.